The single most influential phrase coined by an American novelist in the 20th century was almost called something else. Joseph Heller's manuscript was titled Catch-22. He had been working on it for 8 years. It was scheduled for publication in October of 1961 by Simon & Schuster. And then, for months before press, the publisher Leon Uris released a novel called Mila-18. Heller's editor told him, gently, that 2 war novels in the same year, both with the number 18 in the title, would be a marketing disaster. Heller spent 2 weeks staring at the manuscript, trying every other number. He tried Catch-11. He tried Catch-14. He tried Catch-17. None of them sounded right. He found, eventually, that the number 22 had a particular Yiddish cadence repetition to it, 22, 22, and that the digit echoed something about the trapped, recurring, infinite quality of the bureaucratic logic the novel was actually about. He sent in the change. The book came out as Catch-22 in October of 1961. Within 5 years, the phrase had entered the Oxford English Dictionary as a common noun. There is, in the English language, a small handful of book titles that have crossed over so completely into ordinary speech that most people who use them have never read the book. Catch-22 is one of them. So is Big Brother. So is Lolita. So is Frankenstein. These are titles that have become words. They are units of common cognition. They are the way we point, in everyday conversation, at concepts we did not know how to point at before the book existed. This is the story of how Joseph Heller, a 40-year-old Brooklyn copywriter who had spent the previous 8 years writing a novel in his off hours on the floor of his apartment in Manhattan, produced a single phrase that, 65 years later, the entire English-speaking world uses several times a day, often without remembering where it came from. To understand the phrase, you have to understand the novel. Catch-22 is, on the surface, a war novel. It is set on a fictional Italian island called Pianosa in the year 1944 in the 256th Squadron of the United States Army Air Force's AB 25 medium bomber squadron flying missions against German positions in northern Italy and southern France. The novel's central character is a 28-year-old captain named John Yossarian, a bombardier from Brooklyn who has flown 48 combat missions. He has decided, at the beginning of the novel, that the war is trying to kill him personally and that he must stop flying. He spends the rest of the novel attempting, by increasingly inventive means, to be grounded. The trouble is the catch. In Chapter 5, Yossarian goes to see the squadron doctor, a man named Doc Danica. He explains that he is afraid. He explains that he is going crazy with fear. He asks to be grounded. Danica explains, in the calmest possible voice, that there is a regulation that covers exactly this situation. The regulation is called Catch-22. Danica explains it. There was only one catch, and that was Catch-22, which specified that a concern for one's own safety in the face of dangers that were real and immediate was the process of a rational mind. Or was crazy and could be grounded. All he had to do was ask, and as soon as he did, he would no longer be crazy and would have to fly more missions. Or would be crazy to fly more missions and sane if he didn't, but if he was sane he had to fly them. If he flew them he was crazy and didn't have to, but if he didn't want to he was sane and had to. Yossarian listens to this. He says, in awe, that's some catch, that Catch-22. It's the best there is, Doc Danica agrees. That is the phrase. That is the thing. That is the small, perfectly logical, perfectly cruel piece of bureaucratic geometry that became, by the late 1960s, the way English speakers refer to any situation in which the rules are designed in such a way that the only escape from the trap is the action the trap forbids. The novel is structured to demonstrate, over 400 pages, that Catch-22 is not just a military regulation. It is the master rule of every institution Yossarian encounters. It is the rule of the bombing squadron. It is the rule of the hospital. It is the rule of the chaplain's interrogation. It is the rule of the bombardier's love affairs. It is the rule of the mess hall, in which a captain named Milo Minderbinder has built a private corporation called M&M Enterprises that buys eggs from the squadron at 7 cents, sells them at the squadron's mess at 5 cents, and makes a profit. When Yossarian asks Milo how he is making a profit by buying high and selling low, Milo explains that everyone in the syndicate has a share. When Yossarian asks how that helps, Milo says, everyone has a share. That is Catch-22 in business form. The novel is set in 1944, but it was written between 1953 and 1961. During the early Cold War and the McCarthy era and the Eisenhower post-war bureaucratic expansion of the United States federal government and the American corporate world. Heller, who had himself flown 60 combat missions as a B-25 bombardier in the Mediterranean theater in 1944, did not write it as a war memoir. He wrote it as an attack on the machinery of post-war American institutional life. The B-25 Squadron was, for him, a model of every other large American institution he had worked in after the war: Time magazine, the McCall Corporation, advertising agencies in Manhattan, university faculties at Penn State and Yale. He saw, in the white-collar bureaucratic America of the 1950s, the same logic he had seen in the Air Force in 1944. The squadron commander who keeps raising the number of missions required to qualify for rotation home. The mess officer who runs a private syndicate inside the military supply system. The chaplain who is investigated by his own superiors for failing to provide moral guidance on the grounds that he is too uncertain about moral questions to be useful. The hospital doctor who treats a dead man, Doc Danica, who is officially listed as dead because his name was on the manifest of a plane that crashed, and who therefore cannot collect a salary or receive mail, even though he is alive and walking around the base. Every absurd episode is a piece of post-war America in 1944 costume. Heller wrote the novel slowly. He had a full-time job. He wrote at home in the evenings and on weekends. He filled, on his own account, hundreds of index cards with possible scenes, possible character names, possible jokes. He restructured the novel several times, eventually arriving at a non-linear structure in which scenes from different points in time are interleaved without warning, so that the reader has to assemble the chronology from internal clues. He revised individual sentences obsessively. He was a perfectionist comic stylist. He believed that the right joke at the right pace was a more powerful form of indictment than any earnest moralizing. When the novel came out in October 1961, the initial reviews were mixed. The New York Times Book Review was lukewarm. Time magazine was hostile. Some serious literary critics dismissed the book as a long, shaggy dog story that did not know whether it wanted to be a war novel or a satire on advertising. But the readers found it. By word of mouth on college campuses in the early 1960s, Catch-22 began to spread. By 1964, it was on the New York Times bestseller list. By 1968, it had sold 2 million copies. By the early 1970s, when the Vietnam War had taught a generation of American readers exactly what Heller had been describing, the phrase Catch-22 had become a generic noun in English. The Oxford English Dictionary's first recorded use of Catch-22 as a common noun, meaning a situation involving a dilemma in which the desired outcome is impossible because of mutually conflicting conditions, dates from a 1971 newspaper article. The novel was 10 years old. It has been in print continuously since. It has sold, by current estimates, more than 10 million copies in English alone. It has been translated into 30 languages. The phrase has been borrowed into French, into Spanish, into Portuguese, into Japanese, into Russian, into German, sometimes translated, sometimes simply borrowed wholesale as a loan word. It is one of the very few English novels of the 20th century whose title has become an international common noun. What is the modern relevance? It is, I think, more direct now than it was in 1961. Every modern reader has encountered Catch-22 in the literal sense, in dealing with a health insurance company, in trying to enroll in a federal benefit, in attempting to challenge an algorithmic decision made by a corporation that has no human decision-maker to challenge, in trying to leave a subscription service that requires you to call a phone number that only works during hours you are at work. The bureaucratic infinite loop, the rule designed in such a way that the only path through it requires the action it forbids, is, in 2026, a far more common feature of everyday life than it was in 1944 or 1961 or 1971. Heller had identified the pattern early. The genius of the novel is not that it described a single absurd military regulation. The genius of the novel is that it described a kind of institutional logic that has, in the 65 years since, taken over much of the developed world. The pattern is in tax codes. The pattern is in immigration policy. The pattern is in financial regulation. The pattern is in the algorithms that govern who is granted a mortgage, who is allowed to fly, who is permitted to post a video on a streaming platform. Every large institution that has automated its decision-making has produced, somewhere in its machinery, a Catch-22, a rule whose only resolution is the action it forbids. We have a word for this now. We did not have one before October 1961. The word came from a 40-year-old advertising copywriter from Brooklyn who had served as a bombardier and had spent 8 years writing a novel in his apartment evenings. He died in December 1999 at the age of 76. He had spent the rest of his life writing 6 more novels, none of which was as successful as Catch-22. He once gave an interview in which he was asked if it bothered him that he was unlikely to write anything as significant again. He said, "Yes, but who has?" That is, in essence, the answer of a man who understood what he had produced. One title in the language. One phrase, in every newspaper, in every conversation, in every legal complaint, in every email someone writes about an absurd corporate situation. A single perfect piece of useful vocabulary contributed to the world, by accident, by a Brooklyn copywriter who took 8 years to find it. If this changed how you think about Catch-22, subscribe. We break down the most important books ever written, one argument at a time. New video every week. And if this was worth 10 minutes of your life, hit like. It helps the channel more than you think.